March 7, 1945, 12:56 in the afternoon. The heights overlooking Remagen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Emmett Burrows emerged from the dark woods of the Eifel Mountains onto a bluff, his boots crunching against frozen earth. Below him stretched the Rhine Gorge, wrapped in the pale haze of early spring. The air carried the acrid smell of smoke from distant artillery and the damp cold that seeped through wool uniforms. His breath formed clouds in front of his face as he raised his field glass with trembling hands. What he saw defied every tactical assumption of the past 6 months. The Ludendorff Bridge still stood. 1,069 feet of blackened steel and stone, spanning the 300 meters of the Rhine River that represented Germany's last natural defense against invasion from the west. Its twin stone towers rose like fortress sentinels on either bank, their surfaces dark with grime and decades of industrial soot. German vehicles and troops streamed across its spanning chaotic retreat, a river of defeat flowing eastward. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann arrived moments later, followed by Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann, the task force commander. Through their binoculars, they watched history pivot on a single structure. Every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had received explicit orders to destroy all crossings before Allied forces could reach them. Yet there it stood, impossibly intact, like a gift wrapped in explosives and machine gun fire. The Rhine had been Germany's moat since Roman times, a liquid barrier that separated civilization from barbarism in the minds of those who built empires along its banks. By March 1945, it represented something more desperate, the final line between the advancing Allied armies and the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. For 9 months since D-Day, American, British, and Canadian forces had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, across the fields of France, through the hell of the Ardennes winter, and up to the western bank of this ancient river. The Allies had systematically bombed every bridge crossing the Rhine for months, turning German supply lines into rubble, and trapping entire divisions on the wrong side of the river. Operation Lumberjack, led by the U.S. First Army, aimed to secure the West Bank and prepare for a massive crossing to be led by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group farther north. The plan called for meticulous preparation, amphibious operations, pontoon bridges, and the full weight of Allied air superiority. Nobody expected to simply walk across. The bridge at Remagen was never supposed to matter. Built in 1916 during the First World War, named after General Erich Ludendorff, the railroad bridge existed to ferry German reinforcements and supplies to the Western Front. It was functional, not strategic. The approaches on either side led into the most rugged terrain of the Westerwald region, where roads twisted through steep hills and narrow valleys. Military planners on both sides had identified it as one of the worst possible crossing sites. Yet on that cold March afternoon, the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, advancing unexpectedly quickly through collapsing German defenses, found themselves staring at the only intact bridge across the Rhine in the entire sector. Brigadier General William M. Hogue, an engineer soldier commanding the Combat Command, stood on that bluff and faced a decision that would alter the course of the war. His orders were to turn south and link up with Patton's Third Army. But here was the Rhine, and here was a bridge, and every second of hesitation was a second closer to its destruction. The German defenders at Remagen operated in a fog of confusion that would have been comic had the stakes not been so catastrophic. Command authority fractured across multiple competing hierarchies. Captain Willie Branch served as combat commander of the Remagen area with nominal authority only in emergencies. Captain Karl Fresnhahn commanded as the technical bridge officer responsible for demolitions. An anti-aircraft officer answered to the Luftwaffe, not to either captain. Volkssturm units took orders from Nazi party officials. This chaos reflected the disintegration of German command structure along the entire Rhine front. Responsibility for bridge defense had belonged to military districts called Wehrkreis, which answered to the Waffen-SS rather than the regular army. As the front collapsed westward in early March, authority was supposed to transfer to army commanders, but jealousy and bureaucratic paralysis meant nobody truly controlled anything. General Bachsch, who commanded the Bonn-Remagen sector, spent the first week of March driving between command posts trying to resolve conflicts between Field Marshal Model at Army Group B and General Zane of the 15th Army, who disagreed on where the main American thrust would hit Bonn or Remagen. On March 6th, Model transferred Bachsch to command the shattered LII Corps, without allowing him time to brief his successor. The one German commander who understood the deteriorating situation was removed at the moment his knowledge mattered most. Captain Bridge had 36 men in his company to defend Remagen and its bridge. Captain Friesenhahn commanded a handful of engineers. The Volkssturm were unreliable conscripts drafted from their homes with the belief they would fight harder to defend their own towns. They would not. Anti-aircraft troops that had been positioned on the West Bank abandoned their posts in mid-morning on March 7th, joining the flood of retreating soldiers, horse-drawn artillery, supply wagons, wounded men, and civilian refugees that clogged the bridge. Bridge had requested 600 kilograms of military explosives to wire the bridge for demolition. At 11 in the morning, he received half that amount, 300 kilograms of detonated, a weak industrial explosive used in mining operations. It was civilian-grade material, not military ordnance. He placed all of it on the southeastern pier. At 2 in the afternoon, as American tanks appeared on the western approaches, he detonated charges under the stone archway connecting the embankment to the bridge, blowing a 9-meter crater in the roadbed. He hoped it would slow the American armor. It did not. The German engineers had prepared the Ludendorff Bridge for demolition with Teutonic thoroughness a year before the war ended. An electric fuse connected to explosives through cables encased in thick steel pipe. If the electric system failed, a primer core could be ignited by hand to trigger emergency charges, but orders from OKW German High Command complicated execution. After an American bomb prematurely detonated demolition charges at a bridge in Cologne, destroying it before retreating German troops could cross, new directives arrived. Explosives were to be placed only when the front came within 8 kilometers of a bridge, and igniters were not to be attached, until demolition seemed unavoidable. Both the preparation order and the demolition order itself required written authorization from the officer bearing tactical responsibility. This was German bureaucracy meeting German collapse. At 11:15 on March 7th, as Captain Bridge checked unit orders at the bridge, a red-eye major approached. His name was Hans Scheller. General Hitzfeld of the LXVII Corps had sent him to take command at Remagen. Scheller had departed at 2 in the morning with 8 men and a radio in 2 vehicles. In the darkness and chaos, his vehicle separated from the one carrying the radio. Running low on fuel, he detoured south to find gasoline. He arrived at Remagen at 11:15, 4 hours before the bridge was scheduled to be attacked, without communications equipment and without knowledge of the local situation. American tanks entered Remagen shortly after 3 in the afternoon. Task Force Engelmann, built around the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion, included a platoon of new experimental T-26 Pershing tanks mounting 90mm guns. Lieutenant Timmermann's Company A led the advance through streets where civilians hung white flags from windows, many of them weeping. German resistance was sporadic, disorganized. A machine gun position in the town square was quickly destroyed by the Pershings. At 15:15, word arrived from another American column that had captured a bridge over the Ahr River. A German civilian claimed the Ludendorff Bridge was scheduled for demolition at exactly 1,600 hours. The information was false, but it spurred General Hogue to action. He might lose a battalion if the Germans blew the bridge while his men crossed it. He might lose a platoon if they destroyed it during the crossing. On the other hand, the Rhine was right there, and so was the bridge, and opportunities like this did not wait for permission or perfect planning. He turned to Colonel Engelmann and gave the order, "Get to that bridge as soon as possible." At the bridge itself, Major Scheller watched American tanks approaching through the smoke and dust of battle. An artillery captain insisted his battalion and its guns were following close behind and needed the bridge to escape. Scheller felt keenly that combat units should not be penalized by having their retreat cut off, particularly when they brought precious artillery pieces with them. He delayed. Captain Friesenhahn, the engineer, waited for written orders to destroy the bridge. The order finally came. Friesenhahn entered the railroad tunnel at the eastern end of the bridge where the electric detonator was located. He turned the key. Nothing happened. He turned it again. Nothing. He turned it a third time. The circuit was dead. An American tank shell had severed the protected line minutes earlier. Friesenhahn called for volunteers to go onto the bridge and light the primer cord by hand. Nobody volunteered. Finally, a sergeant named Faust said he would do it. He crawled 80 to 90 yards across the bridge while machine gun fire and tank rounds tore through the air around him. He reached the charges, lit the primer cord, and ran back. Moments later, a massive explosion lifted the bridge as if to tear it from its foundations. Timbers, dirt, and debris shot skyward. Captain Friesenhahn breathed a sigh of relief. When the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The explosion had torn holes in the planking over the railroad tracks, but the footpaths on either side remained intact. Lieutenant Timmermann ordered his men to attack. They bobbed and weaved across a span, dashing from the cover of one metal girder to another. Machine gun fire from the towers near the east bank spattered among them. Return fire from American riflemen and the purging tanks suppressed the German gunners. Sergeants and a lieutenant from the engineer detachment followed close behind, cutting every wire they could find that might lead to additional demolitions. They shot cables apart with their carbines. Sergeant Alex Drobik, an assistant squad leader, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Lieutenant Timmermann followed moments later. By the time they secured the far side and began climbing the steep cliff called the Erpelerlay, Major Scheller in the railroad tunnel was trying desperately to contact his headquarters by radio to report that the bridge still stood. He had no radio. He mounted a bicycle and pedaled off into history. Captain Bradge, Captain Friesenhahn, and the other Germans inside the tunnel surrendered as American troops appeared at both ends. The sound that followed would echo through the remaining weeks of the war. Not the sound of explosions or gunfire, but the steady mechanical rhythm of American logistics, the grinding of tank treads on damaged steel, the rumble of truck engines idling in columns that stretched back for miles, the hammering of engineer battalions working through the night to repair the bridge, their welding torches casting orange light across the dark water, the splash of pontoon sections being positioned for emergency crossings, the continuous drone of hundreds of anti-aircraft guns being in place to protect the bridgehead, their barrels pointing skyward in the greatest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery assembled during the entire war. This was the sound of American industrial might crossing a German river, and it did not stop. Within 24 hours, 8,000 American troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen, including 2 armored infantry battalions, 1 tank battalion, 1 tank destroyer company, 9 infantry battalions, and artillery units. The sound of that crossing was the sound of German defeat made audible. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, called the bridge worth its weight in gold. General Omar Bradley's reaction was more visceral. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust 'em wide open. Shove everything you can across it." Winston Churchill called it a stroke of luck. But for the German High Command, the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was catastrophic beyond measure. Hitler learned of it on March 8, and his response was immediate and apoplectic. The bridge must be destroyed at all costs. Every weapon in the German arsenal was thrown at Remagen over the next 10 days in a desperate attempt to undo what could not be undone. Infantry and armor attacked the bridgehead. Artillery bombarded the crossing sites. More than 100 individual artillery pieces unleashed high-explosive fire, striking the bridge 24 times. A 280-millimeter railroad gun fired from maximum range, though most shells fell short. Floating mines were sent down the Rhine. Explosive-laden barges were launched at the pontoon bridges. German frogmen, wearing Italian underwater breathing apparatus, swam toward the bridge supports carrying demolition charges. American searchlights, a new technology called canal defense lights, illuminated the dark water, and the frogmen were killed or captured. The Luftwaffe launched nearly 400 sorties against the bridge and the bridgehead. This included missions by the newest Arado R-234 turbojet bombers, among the most advanced aircraft in the world. The jet pilots flew through the densest anti-aircraft screen ever assembled by the American military, nearly 700 anti-aircraft guns firing at anything with wings. American gunners claimed to have shot down more than 100 German aircraft, roughly 30% of all planes dispatched. Hermann Göring called for volunteers to fly suicide ramming missions into the bridge. 2 pilots from Kampfgeschwader 51 volunteered, but the mission was never flown. On March 14th, Hitler ordered SS General Hans Kammler to fire V-2 rockets at the bridge, the first and only time the ballistic missiles were used against a tactical target. 11 V-2s were launched from sites in the Netherlands between I-11 and March 17th. Not one hit the bridge. The closest direct hit landed 300 meters away, striking the command post of the 284th Engineer Combat Battalion, killing 3 Americans and wounding 30. Other rockets fell in Remagen itself, killing German civilians, or exploded harmlessly in the river or open countryside. Even the Karl Timmermann Super Heavy Mortar, a 600-millimeter behemoth, was deployed and fired approximately 14 rounds starting on March 16th. It caused considerable damage within the town, but never hit the bridge itself. The German defenders had expected the bridge to be gone before American troops could reach it. They expected orders to arrive on time and explosives to work as design and bureaucracy to function even in collapse. They expect the retreat to be orderly and command to be unified and the Rhine to remain an impassable barrier until the Allies brought their full logistical weight to bear in a set-piece crossing operation. What they experienced instead was chaos compounding failure compounding humiliation. Captain Friesenhahn turned the key 3 times and nothing happened. The primer cord was lit by a brave sergeant and the bridge lifted into the air and settled back onto its foundations. American soldiers ran across under fire while German officers demanded written orders to do what should have been done an hour earlier. The mythology of German efficiency shattered as completely as if the bridge itself had been demolished. German generals would later say, "Remagen killed us." It was not the tactical loss of one bridge. It was the psychological demolition of the belief that precision and discipline could overcome the weight of American material superiority. American engineers worked with relentless intensity to keep the damaged bridge standing and to build alternatives. The Rhine at Remagen flows fast, approximately 300 meters wide with a gravelly bottom that resisted standard anchoring techniques. Engineers fabricated special anchors by welding Bailey panels together, lining them with reinforcing steel wire, and filling them with rock. Each anchor weighed 6 to 8 tons. They strung nets across the river to catch floating mines. They built a steel treadway bridge and a heavy reinforced pontoon bridge upstream from the Ludendorff Bridge. Lieutenant Colonel H.F. Cameron commanded the 164th Engineer Battalion, responsible for river protection. His men worked under constant enemy fire day and night, with the knowledge that a single successful German attack could trap thousands of American troops on the wrong side of the Rhine, or cut the bridgehead off from reinforcement. The sound of their work, the pounding of pile drivers, and the grinding of construction equipment became the soundtrack of the American advance. On the afternoon of March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. It had endured months of Allied bombing before the war reached it. Direct artillery hits during the battle near misses from V-2 rockets, constant traffic from tanks and trucks, and the stress of hasty repairs under fire. At 3 in the afternoon, a low rumbling groan echoed across Remagen. Soldiers stopped and looked skyward, searching for the source. The groan became the shriek of tearing steel. 200 engineers working on the bridge felt it buckle beneath their feet. They ran. Some made it to shore. 28 men were killed in the collapse, 18 of them missing and presumed drowned in the swift current. 63 others were injured. But by the time the bridge fell, American combat engineers had finished their pontoon and treadway bridges. Over 125,000 troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 5 divisions established a bridgehead with accompanying tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks. The Americans broke out of the bridgehead on March 25, 18 days after the bridge was captured. Some German and American military authorities agreed that capturing the bridge shortened the war by weeks, perhaps months. The recurring sound through all of this was not German efficiency or Japanese fanaticism or ideological fervor. It was the industrial hum of American abundance. The sound of welding torches working through the night. The sound of truck convoys that stretched for miles carrying fuel and medical supplies and replacement parts. The sound of hundreds of anti-aircraft guns firing in coordinated barrages. The sound of Bailey bridges being assembled and pontoon sections being floated into position and pile drivers sinking anchors into the riverbed. The sound of a logistics system so vast and so relentless that it could absorb the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge without pause, could replace 1 crossing with 3, could feed 5 divisions across a river while simultaneously protecting them from air attack and building roads through the Westerwald Hills on the far side. This sound was not heroic in the cinematic sense. It was not the sound of warriors charging into battle. It was the sound of a democratic industrial society mobilized for total war, and it was unstoppable. Hitler's response to Remagen revealed the bankruptcy of totalitarian certainty. He fired Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, and 4 other generals. He appointed a special court-martial under General Rudolf Hubner with its own execution squad. 4 days after the bridge was lost, the court tried and executed Major Hans Scheller and Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, the officers who had failed to destroy it. Captain Willie Bragg was condemned to death in absentia, already a prisoner of the Americans. Majors Herbert Strobel and August Kraft were also executed by firing squad. Their bodies are buried in Bernbach, 35 kilometers from Remagen. Captain Friesenhahn, who had turned the key 3 times and sent a sergeant to light the primer cord by hand, was prosecuted in absentia but acquitted. He survived the war and returned to Remagen. Hitler's fury could not change the fact that American troops stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine with a bridgehead 6 divisions strong, and the last natural barrier to the invasion of Germany's industrial heartland had been breached not through elaborate amphibious operations, but because a bridge that should have been destroyed was not, and American soldiers ran across it under fire. The transformation in perception was complete on both sides. For the Americans, Remagen proved that German defenses were brittle, that the mythology of Teutonic invincibility was hollow, that speed and initiative could achieve what caution and planning might have missed. The unexpected capture of an intact bridge validated the doctrine of exploitation, of pushing forward when the enemy faltered, of taking risk when opportunity presented itself. For the Germans, Remagen was the moment when even the most fanatical officers understood that the war was lost. Not lost in the abstract future tense of strategic assessments, but lost in the immediate concrete sense of American tanks crossing the Rhine while German command structure disintegrated into competing bureaucracies, and V-2 rockets fell wide of their targets, and jet aircraft flew through walls of anti-aircraft fire and achieved nothing. The bridge at Remagen destroyed something more fundamental than German defensive plans. It destroyed the belief that will could overcome material, that discipline could substitute for resources, that a smaller force could prevail through superior spirit alone. The epilogue to Remagen is not written in the rubble of the collapsed bridge or the graves of the 28 American engineers who died when it fell. It is written in the sound that echoed across Germany for the next 7 weeks as American, British, and Soviet forces converged on Berlin. The sound of democratic abundance made manifest in steel and concrete and fuel and food. The sound of a political system that could mobilize industrial capacity on a continental scale without terror or coercion, that could feed armies across oceans and rivers simultaneously, that could replace losses faster than they occurred, and build bridges faster than they could be destroyed. The Ludendorff Bridge stood for 10 days after its capture. In those 10 days, it became a symbol of something the totalitarian mind could not comprehend, that freedom and abundance were not weaknesses to be exploited but sources of strength that multiplied with scale. The bridge at Remagen was never rebuilt. The twin stone towers remain on either bank, converted into a museum on the west side and a performing arts space on the east. Locals voted in 2020 to construct a new pedestrian and bicycle suspension bridge, because without a crossing there is no river passage for 44 kilometers. But the ghost of the Ludendorff Bridge endures in military academies and staff colleges where officers study the decisions made in a handful of hours on March 7, 1945. General Hogue's choice to disobey orders and seize the bridge. Lieutenant Timmermann's decision to lead his men across a span wired with explosives that might detonate at any second. The engineers who cut cables under fire and the sergeants who were first across. And the anti-aircraft gunners who fired at anything with wings. And the combat engineers who died when the bridge finally fell. Their actions compressed into a single lesson about the nature of warfare between ideologies, that totalitarian systems fracture under stress because they cannot tolerate deviation from plan, while democratic systems improvise because they must. The sound of American troops crossing the Rhine at Remagen in March 1945 was the sound of history pivoting from one era to another. It was the sound of the Second World War ending and the American century beginning. It was the sound of industrial abundance defeating ideological fervor, of logistics overwhelming tactics, of a democratic society mobilized for total war, proving that freedom and efficiency were not contradictions but complements. The German engineers who wired the Ludendorff Bridge with explosives and declared its destruction inevitable were not wrong about the explosives. They were wrong about the nature of the war they were fighting. It was not a war that could be won by blowing bridges at the last possible moment. It was a war that would be won by the side that could build 3 new bridges before the old one finished collapsing, and that side was never in doubt once the first American soldiers set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and the sound of their crossing echoed through the hills and valleys of Germany like a promise and a judgment and a bell tolling the end of one world and the beginning of another.